Material prosperity. We must never conclude that material prosperity and political power are indications that God approves of our lifestyle. Here's Gene.
To understand this principle, we need to understand what was happening during the time that Amos prophesied. The children of Israel, at that time, when Amos was prophesying, were actually experiencing economic prosperity. Tremendous economic prosperity. They were having military successes. And unfortunately, they concluded that it was God's blessing. Even though their leaders were parading their wealth, parading their position, were given over to materialism and immorality as well. And Amos prophesied against them that judgment was going to come. And that's what we read about in Amos chapter 6. In several of these verses, let me share them with you. Verse 4, they lie on beds inlaid with ivory, sprawled out on their couches, and dine on lambs from the flock and calves from the stall. He's talking about the leaders in Israel who are saying, thank God he's blessing us, even though they were devoted to idolatry in terms of materialism. Verse 6, they drink wine by the bowlful, anoint themselves with the finest oils, but do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. In other words, that there is deterioration because of sin within the tribes of Israel, using Joseph as an illustration. Verse 14 speaks of judgment. But look, I am raising up a nation against you, house of Israel. And then Amos says, this is the declaration of the Lord, the God of hosts. And this nation, they will oppress you from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of the Arabah. You're going to be judged because of your materialism, and you're going to be judged because of the fact that you're now engaged in this kind of idolatry. And as we think about that, as we think about what we read in the New Testament, I think there's a lesson here for all of us. And that is, material prosperity and success and power are not conclusive evidence of God's approval of the way we live. Actually, Jesus said this, He, God, causes His sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So the fact that we have material prosperity is not a sign of God's blessing. Now, it's certainly a blessing from God, and we need to thank Him for that blessing, but it's not necessarily because of our righteousness and the way we are living. And Jesus made that very, very clear. James addressed this issue and how to handle material blessings when he wrote and said, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. Now, don't make a mistake. He's not saying it's wrong to go from this city to that city and make a profit. There's nothing wrong in being a good businessman or a businesswoman. There's nothing wrong in making money per se. The problem is when we love it and it becomes a god. And so James goes on to say, you don't even know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like smoke that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And you see, he's dealing with the fact that we feel like we're in control of our lives. That's idolatry in itself. And so he goes on to say, instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. In other words, filling in the blank, he's saying, you should say, if it's the Lord's will that I go to this city or that city and make money. If it's the Lord's will. If it's God's will. In other words, putting God first in everything we do. But as it is, James says, you boast in your arrogance, and that's idolatry. You boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil, so it is a sin for the person who knows to do what is good and doesn't do it. Come now, you rich people. And he's dealing there with a special problem within the Christian community. Weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. He warns them. You have lived luxuriously on the land, have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. And doesn't that sound like the same kind of thing that Amos was saying in the Old Testament? In dealing with the fact that they believed that God was blessing them in spite of the way they were living. He was blessing them because, as Jesus said, the sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's God's mercy, and obviously it's God's grace. So, in what ways can the teaching that it's always God's will to provide His children with good health and material prosperity lead to inconsistencies in our lives? And there are those who teach that if we're walking in the will of God, then we should be blessed with health, we should be blessed with wealth. Or they will say that this is God's will for our lives. And that can lead to some serious problems, that kind of theology. For example, people believe that God is blessing them even though they're engaged in sinful practice. Ever met anyone like that? There are business people in our culture today who believe that they're wealthy even though they lie and cheat and deceive and are dishonest and lack integrity. They believe that they're being blessed by God. And if God was upset with them, they wouldn't have any wealth. And they wouldn't have health. I can show you people that have great health and great wealth. They've been living for the devil most of their life. That's God's grace. So we can draw false conclusions if we don't understand this. For example, another issue is they just may be making more and more money. And they say, well, if God weren't blessing me, I wouldn't be making all this money. And if you look at their lifestyle, they don't have their priorities straight. They're not being generous. They conclude that God is pleased with their behavior. And you and I know that some of the wealthiest people in the world are unbelievers and pagan. Absolutely pagan. They're selfish. They even reject belief in a personal God. So what I'm simply saying is that this principle, and let me state it because it summarizes it, we must never conclude that material prosperity and political power are indications that God approves of our lifestyle. Now, He may bless us as Christians, and we may be living in the will of God, and we should always glorify Him for that, but we should never, ever use the blessings that God gives us as an excuse to violate His values, to violate His principles, because we misinterpret that concept of material prosperity in our culture and other cultures of the world.